and welcome, and in this video we're going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring. Now a quick heads up, I will not be covering how to factor in this video. If you need to learn how to factor, I have 4 videos factoring out the greatest common factor, difference of squares, and factoring quadratic trinomials. Make sure you check those out first because we are going to be jumping right into how to solve by factoring. So let's take a look at this problem. We have x squared minus 5x minus 9 is equal to 3 minus x. Now, the first thing that you need to do when solving by factoring is to get everything on one side of the equation. So I'm going to move the 3 and the x over to the left-hand side of the equation. That way, everything is on one side. Now, once we have everything on one side of the equation, the next thing we need to do is we need to factor. Now, always look for a greatest common factor first. We don't have one here, so we're just going to go straight into factoring this trinomial. And like I said, I'm not going to cover how to factor. This is just going to go straight to its factored form. And its factored form would be x minus 6 and x plus 2. So this would end up being our factored form. Now, what we have to do is using something called the zero product property. Now, the zero product property basically states, okay, let's say you have a bunch of numbers multiplying each other. In this case, we have 2 separate numbers. We have x minus 6, that's going to be one number, and x plus 2, that's going to be another number. Let's say you have a bunch of numbers, in this case, 2 numbers multiplying each other, and they end up getting you 0. What that means is the first number can be 0, or the second number could be 0, or maybe both of them are 0. So that's what the zero product property states. And the way we use it is we set each factor with a variable in it equal to 0 and solve. So x minus 6 is a factor with a variable in it, so I'm going to set it equal to 0. And so is x plus 2. So I set each factor with a variable in it equal to 0 and solve. So to get this, I'm going to add 6 to each side. To get x is equal to 6, I'm going to subtract 2 from each side to get x is equal to negative 2. So what that means is that we have 2 solutions of x equals 6 and x equals negative 2. These would end up being our 2 answers. Now, what do they actually mean though? Well, what we're actually finding whenever we solve a quadratic equation, whether it be by factoring or completing the square quadratic formula, we'll learn about those later, is we are actually finding the x-intercepts of the graph. So if I graph this part right here, if I graph x squared minus 4x minus 12 in the calculator, you will see it cross the x-axis at positive 6 and negative 2. You would end up seeing it cross at positive 6 and negative 2. And that's exactly what we end up seeing here. So if you look at this graph, see we cross at positive 6 and negative 2. So what we're actually finding are the x-intercepts. So that's always a way you can double check your work to make sure that you did it correctly. Now that we know what we're actually finding, let's go ahead and take a look at just a couple more examples. All right, so let's take a look at this example here. So we have 4x squared minus 3x plus 15 is equal to 3x plus 15. Well, remember, what we need to do is get everything on one side of the equation first. So I'm going to move the 3x and the 15 over to the left-hand side. And now what we end up getting is 4x squared minus 6x. The 15s end up canceling. So now I have to factor. And the first thing I should always look for is a greatest common factor. And we do have that here. We have a greatest common factor of 2x. So I'm going to factor out a 2x. And it leaves me with 2x times a quantity of 2x minus 3 is equal to 0. And now what I do is I go ahead and use a zero product property. So I set each factor with a variable in it equal to 0 and solve. So 2x has a variable in it, so I'm setting 2x equal to 0, and I'm also setting 2x minus 3 equal to 0. And what we would end up getting, we divide by 2 to get x is equal to 0, and we add 3, then divide by 2 to get x is equal to 3/2. So these would end up being our 2 answers. And remember, what we're finding are the x-intercepts. So if I went ahead and graphed this particular equation here, we would end up seeing an x-intercept of 0 and 3/2. And that's exactly what we end up seeing here. Let me go ahead and zoom in just a little bit. So as we can see, we have an x-intercept of 0 and of 3/2, which is also 1.5, right? So remember what we're finding, the x-intercepts. So once you have factoring down, solving by factoring really is only one extra step. So that's really it. If you have any questions, make sure that you let me know. There's really not that much more to cover. Just be very careful with your factoring. If you made a mistake factoring, then you're obviously going to get an incorrect answer. So just be very careful with that. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I hope this video was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next